The beacon should not have existed. That was the first thing Dara Quinn thought when the signal crossed her console, 3 weeks into a routine haul through the edge of the static, the long dead stretch of space where light speed relays gave out and a ship was, for all practical purposes, alone. The signal carried a registry number that matched a case file closed 9 years earlier. Closed meant paid out, archived, forgotten. Closed did not mean broadcasting. She sat with that thought for exactly as long as it took to finish her coffee substitute, a grey, faintly bitter concentrate that the ship's synthesizer insisted was coffee and that nobody on board believed. Then she forwarded the ping to the bridge and went back to replacing a coolant seal, because a strange signal from a dead file was interesting, but the seal was leaking, and leaks did not wait for anyone's curiosity. The Long Reach was a salvage tug, 40 years old, patched more times than anyone could count, crewed by 6 people who had learned to like each other slowly and thoroughly, the way you like things that have kept you alive. It ran the outer corridor routes, the long unglamorous hauls between systems, picking up derelicts, drifting cargo, the occasional distress call that the bigger fleets considered too far out to bother with. It was not a glamorous life. The ship's gravity plating hummed a half-tone flat in the aft corridor, a sound everyone aboard had stopped hearing months ago and every new arrival noticed within their first hour. The mess hall served 4 meals that rotated regardless of what the display called them. The one working shower cycled cold for the first 11 seconds no matter how many times Casimir tried to recalibrate it, a fact the crew had quietly stopped mentioning to him out of kindness rather than optimism. It was, in short, a ship built and maintained by people who understood that most of a life spent in deep space was not the dramatic part. It was the seals and the schedules and the bad coffee. Dara had come to find something steadying in that, the plain, repeated ordinariness of a place that expected nothing performative from her, only usefulness, delivered quietly and on time. Dara had been aboard for 4 years. She was the kind of crewmate people described, when asked, as reliable, which was a word that meant exactly what it said and nothing more, and which she had cultivated with some care. She fixed things. She did not raise a voice. She drank the bad coffee without complaint, and when something broke in the middle of the night cycle, she was already awake and already moving before anyone called her name over the comm. None of this was performance. She had simply learned, over the years, that being useful and being unremarkable made an excellent pair of traveling companions. There was a version of herself, younger, freshly off the training relay on her first long posting, who had tried too hard to be liked, who had answered every question with more detail than anyone wanted and had mistaken enthusiasm for competence. That version had learned, over a string of increasingly quiet postings, that a crew trusted the person who fixed the seal without narrating the process far more than the person who explained, at length, exactly how clever the fix had been. She had put that early eagerness away somewhere and had not missed it since. The bridge, when she reached it, held the usual arrangement. Captain Ossa Bren stood at the main display, 4 arms folded in the particular geometry that meant she was thinking rather than reacting, a Bresk habit that took new crew months to read correctly. Io, the ship's communications officer, hovered near the audio panel, her skin already shifting through the pale rippling color that meant she had absorbed some of the tension in the room before anyone had said a word out loud. Fen crew did that. They caught feeling the way other people caught cold. And near the navigation station, trying very hard to look like she belonged there, was Tovi Rel. Tovi was new, an Ilvan cadet on her first long posting, 3 months out from the training relay and still working out which parts of herself to show a crew of strangers. She was small even for her species, with 3 compound eyes that swiveled independently when she was nervous, which was often, and a translucent exoskin that betrayed her feelings before she meant to share them, a fact she clearly found mortifying. "Explain the signal," Bren said, to no one in particular and everyone at once. Io pulled the registry. Case 4419. Colony transport. Filed lost with all hands, insurance settled, wreck marked for salvage rights only, no rescue obligation. She paused. 9 years ago. And now it's transmitting again, Bren said. Now it's transmitting again, Io agreed. Tovi's eyes swiveled toward the display, then toward the captain, then back again, cataloguing the room the way young crew did when they were trying to learn what a serious moment looked like before they were asked to survive one. Could be a fault, she offered. An old beacon waking up on its own. It happens. It could, Bren said. She did not sound convinced. Nobody on the bridge did. Dara looked at the registry coordinates and felt something settle in her chest, quiet and unhurried, the way a hallway feels different the moment before you learn there is something waiting at the end of it. The coordinates sat well past the edge of any relay, deep inside the section of the static that company protocol simply called the cutoff line. Past that line, no one was required to look. Past that line, most crews did not. She said nothing about that yet. She finished the coolant seal instead, because the leak still needed fixing, and some things were true regardless of what waited past a line on a map. The cutoff line was not a law. It was a mercy, and everyone aboard the Long Reach who was not human understood exactly why it existed, in the specific, physical way you understand a thing that lives inside your own body rather than in a rulebook. Every spacefaring species that had crossed into the deep dark eventually developed some version of it. The scientists called it different names depending on which biology they were describing. The crews called it the hush, because that was what it felt like from the inside. Several of them had told Dara over the years, in the careful, half-embarrassed tone people use to describe something involuntary. A situation would cross a certain threshold of hopelessness, a certain ratio of effort to outcome, and something in the mind simply set the effort down. Not fear. Fear was loud. The hush was quiet. It arrived like a held breath finally released, an answer arriving before the question had finished being asked, and it told you, gently and completely, that you had done enough, that continuing would cost you more than it could ever return, that it was time to stop. For the Bresk, the hush came as a total stillness, 4 arms folding inward, a kind of waking sleep. For the Fen, it arrived as an emptying, feeling draining out of the body like water through a cracked hull. Io had described it to Dara once, quietly, during a long night shift, the way you describe an old scar. It isn't sad, she'd said. That's what nobody understands. It doesn't feel like giving up. It feels like being told the truth by someone kind. Dara had listened to that and said nothing, because she did not have a matching story to offer, and offering an empty hand felt worse than offering none at all. She had asked, once, early in her posting, whether the hush ever felt like failure from the inside. Casimir had considered the question with the same unhurried care he gave everything, arms folding and unfolding once before he answered. It is the opposite of failure, he'd said. Failure is a thing you did wrong. The hush only ever tells you the truth about a thing you cannot do at all, no matter how well you did it. That is supposed to be comforting. He had paused then, in a way that suggested he was not entirely certain it was. Some days it is. The distinction had stayed with her. She understood, intellectually, why a species might evolve such a mechanism, the same way a body evolved pain to stop a hand from resting on a hot surface. Grief without limit would grind a mind down to nothing over enough centuries of deep space loss. The hush was the price other species had paid to keep functioning at all, an old, patient trade between suffering and survival, worked out over evolutionary time on worlds that had, in their own ways, taught their people when enough truly was enough. Earth had apparently never gotten the memo. Dara had read the same appendix everyone else had, cause unconfirmed, and had come, privately, to her own theory about it over the years, one she rarely shared because it sounded less like science and more like a story her grandmother might have told, that a species which had spent its whole early history clawing back from ice ages and plagues and each other simply never developed a reflex that told it a situation was hopeless, because on Earth, believing a situation was hopeless had gotten entire generations of people killed. Whatever the real answer was, filed somewhere in a research annex she'd never bothered to read past the summary, the practical result was the same. Humans did not get told when to stop. They had to work that out for themselves, every time, the long way. Humans did not have the hush. This was known, the way odd facts about a species are known, filed alongside the fact that Ilvan cadets communicated distress through subtle shifts in exoskin translucency, or that Bresk found direct eye contact for longer than 4 seconds to be a formal challenge. It was in the crew manuals under a heading nobody read twice. Species notes, human, absence of standard cessation response, cause unconfirmed, see appendix. Most crews treated it the way Tovi had treated it on her first week aboard, as a strange footnote, mildly funny, mostly irrelevant. Humans just kept going. Wasn't that inconvenient for them? Someone had joked once in the mess hall. Wasn't that exhausting? Dara had laughed along, because it was, sometimes. Tova found Dara in the engine bay 2 hours after the bridge meeting, ostensibly to ask about the coolant readings, actually to ask something else entirely, which was easy enough to tell from the way her eyes kept swiveling toward the doorway as though checking whether anyone else was near. "Can I ask you something?" Tova said. "That might be rude." "You can ask," Dara said. "I'll tell you if it's rude." "Does it bother you? Not having it?" The hush. Dara considered the question honestly, the way she tried to consider most things asked of her honestly, because half answers cost more in the long run than people expected. "I've never had it to miss," she said. "That's the strange part about asking a human whether they mind not having an off switch. We don't know what having one feels like. We just keep going until the problem's solved or we can't move anymore. There isn't a third option built in." Tovi's exhaustion shifted, a faint ripple of something that might have been unease. "That sounds lonely." "Sometimes," Dara admitted. "Mostly it's just Tuesday." That got the reaction she'd hoped for, a small surprised chitter of laughter that Tovi immediately looked embarrassed by, as though laughing on duty were a violation of some code she hadn't finished learning yet. "Why are you asking?" Dara said, gentler now. Tovi's home was a cluster of floating colonies above a gas giant, small communities that had, over generations, developed careful rituals around the hush, because for the Ilvan it did not arrive privately the way it seemed to for other species. It arrived visibly, in the shifting color of the exhaustion, in front of family, in front of crews, a public and undeniable signal that could not be hidden or explained away. Growing up, Tovi had watched elders in her community hush during long negotiations, during difficult harvests, during the raising of children who did not survive the colony's thin atmosphere, and had absorbed, without ever being told outright, that there was a kind of grace expected in knowing when to let the reflex take you. Fighting it, in her culture, was considered a small foolishness, the mark of someone who had not yet learned to trust their own biology. She had left home partly because she wanted, badly and privately, to find out whether that was actually true, or whether it was simply the only story her people had ever had the chance to tell themselves. Tovi was quiet for a moment, her eyes settling, finally, all three of them, on the same point in the middle distance. "Because I'm afraid I'll hush too early. On something that mattered. Before I've even tried hard enough to earn it." She said it fast, like something she'd been carrying and wanted to set down before she lost her nerve. "My instructor said it always comes when it's supposed to. That you can't hush before you've genuinely done everything you can. But I don't believe that. I think you can be afraid enough to call it early and mistake the fear for the truth." Dara looked at her for a long moment, young, new, entirely sincere, worried about a failure she hadn't committed yet. "I think," Dara said carefully, "that's a very good thing to be afraid of. It means you already know the difference matters." Tova didn't answer, but her exhaustion settled into something calmer, and she stayed in the engine bay a while longer than the coolant readings required, watching Dara work with the same careful, cataloguing attention she gave everything new. Later that evening, in the mess hall, the crew gathered for the third rotation of what the display insisted was a vegetable stew and everyone privately agreed was closer to a thick, warm soup of good intentions. Io told a long, meandering story about a run 3 years back that had gone sideways over a cargo manifest error, the kind of story the whole crew had heard at least 4 times before and still laughed at in all the right places, because the telling had gotten better with practice even if the facts had gotten looser. Casimir, uncharacteristically talkative after his second bowl, mentioned that he had once, on an early posting, mistaken a docking clamp override for a coffee dispenser control and had spent an anxious 10 minutes convinced he'd stranded an entire supply ship rather than simply picked the wrong bad beverage. Tovi laughed properly at that, an unguarded chittering sound that made her exhaustion flush a warm, pleased color, and for a moment she looked less like a cadet cataloguing a strange new crew and more like someone who had, without quite noticing the moment it happened, started to belong somewhere. "You're quiet tonight," Io said to Dara, near the end of the meal, in the easy, unpressured tone of someone who had learned long ago that Dara's silences were rarely worth worrying about. "Thinking about the beacon," Dara admitted. "The captain's already decided we are not chasing it," Io said. "Company won't authorize it. You heard the same briefing I did." "I heard it," Dara said. "I didn't say I believed it was finished." She said nothing further, because she did not yet have anything more useful to add than a feeling, and feelings, in her experience, were worth keeping quiet about until they had earned the right to be spoken out loud. Bren called the full crew to the bridge that evening, which he did rarely enough that everyone arrived faster than the summons technically required. "The beacon is still transmitting," she said without preamble. "Same signal, same coordinates, past the cutoff line. Company policy is clear. Case 4419 is closed. We are not obligated to respond, and Command will not authorize fuel or hazard pay for a run into confirmed dead space on a 9-year-old ghost signal." "But," said the ship's engineer, an older Bresk named Casimir L., who spoke rarely and precisely, "you called us here anyway." Bren's forearm shifted, unfolding slightly, which for her was the equivalent of a long exhale. Because I ran the signal pattern against the original distress format. It isn't decaying static. It's cycling. Structured. Something out there is still choosing to send it. She let that sit. A dead beacon doesn't choose anything. Something alive is transmitting from inside a case that was closed and paid out 9 years ago. The bridge went quiet in the particular way a room goes quiet when everyone is doing the same math and arriving at the same uncomfortable number. You believe there are still people alive out there, Casimir said. It was not quite a question. I believe, Bren said carefully, that something out there is still choosing to ask. I have run this corridor for 11 years. I have heard old beacons decay into meaningless noise 100 times. This is not that. Whatever is sending this signal is still making decisions about how to send it. That is not a ghost. That is someone, or something, still working the problem. How far past the line? EO asked. 11 hours in system, at cruise. Deep enough that once we are past it, relay contact drops entirely. We'd be running on inertial nav and our own eyes until we are back out the other side. Bren looked around the room, at each of them in turn, the old habit of a captain confirming her crew before asking them to follow her somewhere the manual didn't cover. This is not an order. Company won't back it, which means if it goes wrong out there, it goes wrong on us, not on them. I want to hear reservations before we are an hour past the point where reservations still matter. Casimir spoke first. I have done runs into the static before. I do not enjoy them. But I have never in 40 years ignored a beacon that was still choosing to speak. His arms folded again. Decision made. Further discussion unnecessary. EO's skin had settled into a steady, resolved color that Dara had learned meant agreement reached without much internal argument. I'll monitor the signal the whole way. If it's people, I want to know what they're saying, even before we can answer back. Tova said nothing for a moment, her eyes moving between the captain and the star chart, and Dara watched her work through something privately before she spoke. I want to go, Tova said finally. I know it's further than my training's covered. I know what could happen out there if things go wrong for the rest of you and not for me. Her voice steadied as she said it, the words arriving more certain than she looked. But I'd rather be scared and useful than safe and sorry later that I wasn't there. Bren's attention shifted last to Dara, who hadn't spoken yet, and who didn't feel the need to make much of a speech about it. Casimir looked at Dara for a moment before she could speak, his expression carrying the particular, careful skepticism of someone about to say something he considered kind rather than dismissive. I would ask you to think carefully before volunteering, he said. The rest of us know, with some precision, what our own limits look like when we approach them. We will feel the hush arriving and can plan around it, pace ourselves against it, retreat before it costs us anything unrecoverable. You have no such warning system. If you push past what your body can actually sustain out there, in the cold, in the dark, 11 hours past any help, you will not feel a gentle voice telling you it is time to stop. You will simply keep going until you cannot, and by then it may be too late for anyone to help you either. He said it without unkindness, the plain, careful concern of someone who had watched enough of the deep dark go wrong to want to spell it out clearly rather than assume it understood. I am not saying stay behind. I am saying I do not think you are as safe out there as you believe yourself to be. Dara heard the concern under it, and did not resent it, because it was not wrong, exactly. It was simply incomplete. You're right that I won't feel a warning, she said. I never have. It doesn't mean I don't know how to watch a clock, ration my own effort, and quit a task before my body forces the point for me. I've done it before. It's just work I have to do on purpose, instead of work my biology does for me automatically. That's a difference in method, not in outcome. She met his eyes, the 4-second brusque threshold for challenge, and held it deliberately, not as a dare, but as a statement that she understood the custom and meant to be taken seriously within it. I fix things, she said. 11 hours in or 11 hours further doesn't change what I'm good for. I'm in. Bren held the room silence for one more moment, the captain's habit of letting a decision settle before she called it final. Then she turned to the chart and began plotting the course past the line, and something in the bridge's quiet changed shape, from question to commitment, the way a held breath changes once you've decided to dive. For the record, Bren added, not looking up from the chart, if this goes the way I suspect it might, I will be filing a formal request afterward to have that cutoff line reviewed. A policy that exists to protect a crew from an impossible search is a reasonable policy. A policy that never gets updated when a search stops being impossible is just paperwork pretending to be mercy. She glanced once around the bridge. I would rather be the captain who asked the company an inconvenient question than the captain who let a beacon go quiet because a form told her to. Nobody argued with that either. They crossed the cutoff line 4 hours later. Dara stood at the small observation port near engineering and watched the last relay marker slide past the hull, a single blinking light receding into a darkness that had no other lights in it at all, and felt the particular stillness that came from being somewhere no one back home could currently see. It did not feel like danger exactly. It felt like the forest at the edge of a trail feels, the moment the maintained path gives out and the ground underfoot stops being anyone's responsibility but your own. She had felt that stillness before, in smaller ways, on smaller jobs. She recognized it the way you recognize weather. Behind her, she heard Tovi's footsteps approaching, unhurried, and then the sound of the young Ilvan settling in beside her at the port, 3 eyes fixed on the same swallowing dark. Does it feel different to you? Tovi asked. Out here. Past the line. Dara considered the honest answer. It feels like a place that isn't expecting anyone. That's all. Doesn't mean we don't belong in it. Tova didn't reply, but she didn't move away either, and the two of them stood there a while, watching the dark keep being dark, patient and enormous and entirely unbothered by the small ship moving carefully through the middle of it. The Winterbelle appeared on long-range scan 9 hours later, a slow grey shape tumbling end over end against a backdrop with no stars close enough to throw real light on it. Casimir brought the long reach in on a matching spin, slow and careful, until the derelict's silhouette steadied into something they could actually study instead of merely detect. It had been a colony transport once, built for a one-way run and several thousand sleeping passengers, the kind of ship that carried whole futures in its hold instead of cargo. Half its hull plating had peeled away at some point, exposing ribs of structural framework to the cold the way old wreckage always seemed to, patient and exposed and somehow dignified about it. No running lights. No active thrust. Just the slow tumble of something that had stopped being a ship and become a fact in space instead. Beacon still cycling, Io reported, her voice carefully even. Same structured pattern. It's coming from a compartment near the aft Stacy's bay. Life signs? Bren asked. Io was quiet for a moment, running the scan twice before she answered. Faint. Several dozen, maybe more. Reads consistent with deep Stacy's, not active crew. Whoever's transmitting isn't necessarily who's alive down there. Tovi, at the secondary console, had gone very still, her exoskin paling in a way that made her nerves plainly visible to anyone who looked. 9 years. Colony Stacy's pods aren't rated to hold past 6 without maintenance. No, Casimir agreed. They are not. The math sat in the room for a moment, unspoken and unpleasant. Whatever was keeping several dozen people alive down there had been doing an impossible job for 3 years longer than it was built to manage, and it was still, somehow, choosing to ask for help rather than give up the attempt. They suited up. Bren stayed aboard the long reach to hold position and monitor the crossing. Casimir, Dara, Io, and Tovi went across the tether line in the small transfer pod, the derelict's slow tumble making the approach a careful, patient thing, timed to the rhythm of its spin rather than fought against it. Inside, the Winterbelle was dark in the complete way only a dead ship is dark. No ambient hum, no distant machinery, just the small circles of their suit lights sliding over frost-rimed corridors and drifting debris that had never quite settled after whatever original disaster had ended the ship's working life. Handrails hung loose from bulkheads that had buckled long ago and never been repaired. A child's soft toy, some kind of stitched animal with too many legs, drifted past Dara's shoulder in the near-zero gravity of the dead section, turning slowly end over end, and she reached out without quite deciding to and tucked it into a mesh pocket on her suit, because leaving it tumbling in the dark felt wrong in a way she did not stop to examine. This corridor, Casimir said, checking a hand scanner against the ship's old layout, salvage from registry archive before they'd crossed the line, should lead toward the aft Stacy's bay. Mind the flooring. Structural integrity here is not something I'd wager on. They had not gone 20 meters before the first crack of real danger announced itself, a section of overhead conduit, brittle with 9 years of cold, shearing loose from its mounting and swinging down into the corridor with no warning beyond a faint groan of metal fatigue. Tovi, closest to it, froze completely, 3 eyes locked on the swinging shape, her body caught in the particular stillness of a young creature deciding, in a fraction of a second, whether this was the moment her own biology intended to make a decision for her. It wasn't. Dara had already stepped forward and caught the condor its leading edge with one raised forearm, redirecting its swing into the wall rather than into Tovy's exposed side, a small, undramatic correction that cost her nothing but a jarred shoulder and bought Tova several seconds to remember how to move. "You're all right," Dara said, checking the young Ilvan over quickly. "It's just old metal. It doesn't want anything from you. It's just falling because nothing's held it up in a long time." Tova let out a long breath through her suit's vents, a sound of static rather than air, and nodded, three eyes slowly unlocking from the swinging condor it now stilled against the wall. "I read the reports on runs like this during training," she said. "They never mention how loud the quiet is." "No," Dara agreed. "They usually don't." "This corridor," Casimir said, checking a hand scanner against the ship's old layout, salvage from registry archive before they'd crossed the line, should lead toward the aft Stasis bay. "Mind the flooring. Structural integrity here is not something I'd wager on." They moved carefully, Tovy close behind Dara, her light sweeping the corridor's edges with the tight, cataloguing attention Dara had already come to recognize as the young Ilvan's particular way of managing fear, turning it into information instead of letting it sit unused. "You've done salvage runs like this before," Tova said, quiet over the private channel between them, meant only for the two of them. "Long ones. Dangerous ones." "A few." "Does the hush ever come close for you? Even without arriving?" Dara thought about that honestly as they walked. "I don't think I feel the edge of it the way you might. I just feel tired, sometimes, or frustrated, or scared in a small ordinary way. But it never arrives with an answer already inside it. It's just discomfort. I have to decide what to do about it myself, every single time, with nothing built in to decide it for me." "That sounds like more work," Tova said. "It usually is," Dara agreed. "There's a theory in my training relay's cultural module," Tova said, after a moment, "about why humans don't have it. It suggested that humans simply don't feel loss and hopelessness as deeply as other species, that the hush exists in the rest of us because our grief runs too strong to function through otherwise, and humans are spared it because their grief runs shallower. That's why they can keep going when the rest of us can't." Dara was quiet for a moment, choosing her words the way she chose most things, carefully and without unnecessary weight. "That's a comforting way to explain it," she said. "It's also backwards. It's not that we feel less. We bury people same as anyone, and it costs just as much going in. We just never got handed a mechanism that turns the feeling off once it's too heavy to carry efficiently. So we carry it anyway, badly, however we can, and keep moving regardless of whether we've finished processing what it cost us. It isn't peace. It's just the absence of an exit. Sometimes I think it would be a kindness to have one. I've just never been offered the choice." Tovy's eyes settled on her, something in the young Ilvan's expression shifting, quietly, from the comfortable theory she'd been handed in training to something closer to the plain, complicated truth standing in front of her. "I'm sorry," she said. "I don't think anyone's ever corrected me on that before." "Most people don't get the chance to ask a human directly," Dara said. "It's an easier story, the shallow grief version. Nobody has to feel bad about a species that doesn't need the mercy the rest of you were built with. It's just not a true one." They reached the aft Stasis bay 11 minutes later, and the beam of Casimir's light, sweeping across the wide dim room, found row after row of Stasis pods, most of them dark and silent, several dozen of them, impossibly, still faintly lit along their stator strips, a soft failing amber that flickered with the particular unsteadiness of a system running on its very last reserves. Casimir's light passed slowly across the rows, and for a moment nobody spoke, the sheer scale of it settling over the small team the way scale does when it stops being a number on a scan and becomes something you can actually see. 41 pods. 41 small, sealed lives, each one a person who had gone to sleep expecting to wake up somewhere new and green, and had instead spent 9 years drifting in the dark with no way of knowing whether anyone remembered they existed at all. "Why would Command close this case with pods still reading active?" Tovy asked, her voice tight. "Someone would have seen this on the original scan." "Insurance doesn't pay out on maybes," Io said quietly. 9 years ago, whoever ran the initial assessment likely saw catastrophic hull failure, no response from the beacon at the time, and closed the file on probability rather than certainty. It happens more than the company likes to admit. Deep space is mostly a business of educated guesses, and sometimes the guess is wrong and nobody ever finds out, because nobody goes back to check. And at the center of the room, Wired into the console that had been keeping them alive for 3 years past its rated limit, was the source of the beacon. A small maintenance drone, battered, one of its optical sensors long dead, still patiently, faithfully, transmitting a call for help that its own ship's official record said had been closed and forgotten 9 years before. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Then Tova said, very quietly, in the tone of someone arriving at an understanding rather than asking a question, it never hushed either. The drone's log, when EO finally coaxed it into a diagnostic readout, told a story none of them had expected to find waiting inside a derelict everyone else had agreed to forget. The Winterbell had suffered a catastrophic containment failure in its reactor housing 9 years earlier, the kind of failure that killed the active crew within minutes and should, by any reasonable accounting, have ended the ship's story completely. But the maintenance drone, a simple utility unit never built for anything resembling judgment, had rerouted what power remained toward the Stasis Bay instead of the beacon, on a logic loop so basic it barely qualified as decision-making. Passengers alive, keep passengers alive, all other priorities secondary. It had kept doing that, alone, unthanked, for 3 years past the point its own system should have failed, cannibalizing power from every dead system on the ship it could reach, restructuring its own transmission cycle a dozen times to conserve just enough energy to keep both the Stasis Bay and the beacon alive at once. It's not sentient, EO said, reading the log with something that sounded almost like reverence. It's not choosing this the way we'd choose it. It just never had a threshold built in telling it to stop. Neither do we, Dara said quietly, and nobody on the private channel argued with that. She found herself looking at the drone for a long moment after EO finished reading the log aloud, a small, dented, unglamorous machine that had never been built for anything resembling heroism, that had simply been given one instruction at the start of its working life, keep the passengers alive, and had gone on quietly obeying that instruction long after every reasonable measure said the attempt should have failed. It had not done this because it was brave. It did not have anything in it that could be called brave or afraid. It had simply never been given a threshold that told it the job was finished, and so, in the absence of any such threshold, it had kept working, alone, in the freezing dark, for 3 years nobody had asked of it. There was something in that Dara recognized so completely it took her a moment to name it. It was not admiration exactly, though there was some of that too. It was closer to kinship, the strange, quiet comfort of finding something else in the universe, however small and mechanical, that simply did not know how to stop either. The Stasis pods themselves were the more urgent problem. Of the 41 pods still drawing power, Casimir's scan found 18 with survivors reading strong enough to wake safely, another 14 critical, degrading fast enough that they would fail within hours without intervention, and the remaining 9 already gone, quiet losses the drone had clearly fought and lost across 9 long years alone in the dark. We can't run full power restoration from the long-reach reserves and still make it back across the line, Casimir said, running the numbers twice to be sure of them. We'd have enough to stabilize the critical pods, maybe. Not enough margin to be careless about it. Then we are not careless about it, Bren said over the comm, her voice steady from the ship. Work the 14 critical pods first. Casimir, you and EO rig the power transfer. Dara, Tovi, you're on physical stabilization. Get me eyes on every failing seal before it becomes an emergency instead of a warning. They split up across the wide, cold bay, moving between rows of pods with the particular focus that comes from knowing exactly how much time a problem has left to be solved in. Dara worked fast and quiet, hands moving over frost-stiffened seals with the same unhurried care she gave a leaking coolant line, because panic never made a seal hold better, and she had long ago stopped confusing urgency with speed. It was in the third row that the floor gave out beneath her. Not dramatically. Just a slow, groaning surrender of decking that had been structurally compromised since long before they'd arrived, weakened by 9 years of temperature swings and neglect, finally reaching the end of what it could bear. Dara felt it shift under her boots and had exactly enough time to grab the housing of the nearest pod before the section beneath her dropped away entirely, opening onto a 2-story maintenance shaft below. She held on. The pod housing held. For a handful of seconds, dangling above a dark drop with her boots finding no purchase at all, she simply assessed, the way she assessed most things, the angle of her grip, the strength of the housing, the location of the nearest stable decking 6 feet to her left.
Dara.
Tovi's voice, sharp with alarm, already moving toward her across the trembling floor. Stay back, Dara said, calm and clear. The decking near you won't hold your weight either if you rush it. Come around the left side, slow. Tovi obeyed, picking her way carefully, 3 eyes fixed on Dara's grip the entire time, and reached the stable section just as Dara swung herself up and over onto solid decking with the same unhurried economy she'd used to hold on in the first place. For a moment neither of them said anything. Tovi's exhaustion had gone almost fully pale, the color of pure fear, and it took her several seconds to find her voice. "You didn't even sound afraid," she said. "I was busy," Dara said, checking her own hands for damage out of habit rather than real concern. Being afraid doesn't fix a grip. Deciding where to put your hands does. Tovi looked at her for a long moment, not with pity anymore, not the careful, cataloguing curiosity of the last few days, but something that had shifted, quietly and completely, into something closer to trust. "I want to learn how you do that," she said. "You're already learning," Dara said. "You just came around the left side instead of straight across. That's the whole lesson, right there." They returned to the work in front of them, because the Stacy's pods had not stopped needing attention simply because the floor had briefly disagreed with the idea, and for the next hour the two of them fell into an easy, wordless rhythm, Dara checking seals while Tovi red power feeds aloud in a running, steady murmur that seemed to help her more than it helped anyone else, a kind of narration that turned fear into a list of solvable facts. 12 pods stabilized. Then 13. Casimir's voice crackled over the comm at intervals, dry and precise, confirming the drone's ancient logic loop was accepting the supplemental power without complaint, and somewhere in that long, patient stretch of shared effort, Dara noticed that Tovi's exhaustion had settled into a steady, ordinary color and stayed there, no longer flickering with every small alarm the ship's dying structure offered up. They stabilized 11 of the 14 critical pods over the next 3 hours, a hard, grinding, patient effort that left everyone's suit reserves thinner than any of them liked, and for a brief, exhausted stretch, it felt like they had won. EO reported power transfer holding steady across the restored pods. Casimir confirmed the drone's ancient logic loop had accepted the long-reach supplemental feed without complications. Bren, from the ship, allowed herself the smallest note of something like relief in her voice as she logged the milestone. Even Tovi, exhausted, her exhaustion still faintly pale from the earlier scare, managed something that might have been pride as she watched her section's status light shift from red to amber to a slow, steady green. Then the ship structure, already 9 years past any reasonable expectation of holding itself together, decided it had done enough. It began as a low groan through the hull, felt more than heard, a sound that traveled through boots and gloves before it ever reached anyone's ears properly. Casimir's scanner lit with a structural cascade warning that made him go very still. "The reactor housing," he said. "Whatever's left of it. It's shifting. The containment breach 9 years ago left it barely stable, and our power draws put stress on systems it was never meant to carry again." He looked up, his voice carrying the particular flatness of someone delivering news he wished were different. "We have perhaps 40 minutes before this section of the ship is no longer survivable. Possibly less." "The remaining critical pods," Tovi said immediately. "The 3 we haven't reached yet." "Are on the far side of the bay," Casimir said. "Past the section currently failing beneath our feet." Bren's voice came through steady from a ship, the captain making the calculation none of them wanted to hear out loud. 40 minutes to get 4 people off a structurally failing derelict, minus transit time back to the transfer pod, minus margin for anything else going wrong. That does not leave time to reach 3 additional pods and still get everyone out alive. A pause, heavy with everything it cost her to say the next part. "Pull back. All of you. Now. We got 11 of 14. That's 11 more than anyone expected when we crossed the line." It was, Dara understood immediately, the correct call by every reasonable measure anyone could apply. It was also the exact moment she watched, over the open channel, something shift in Casimir's posture, in the particular stillness that overtook his 4 arms, folding inward with a slow and total finality she recognized now from EO's old description. Not sadness. Not panic. Just a quiet, complete arrival at the end of effort, gentle as a held breath finally released. The rest of the bay had gone very quiet around him, the earlier hard-won relief of 11 stabilized pods curdling fast into something closer to dread, as everyone present did the same silent arithmetic Casimir had just voiced aloud and arrived, each in their own way, at the same uncomfortable understanding. The people best equipped by biology to survive this exact kind of prolonged, grinding crisis were, one by one, running out of the ability to keep trying, precisely because their bodies had been built with an emergency exit that was now, gently and irresistibly, opening. "Casimir," EO said carefully. "I have done what I can," he said, and his voice held no distress at all, only a calm, settled certainty that made it somehow worse to hear. The math is sound. We retreat now. He believed it entirely. That was the strange, quiet horror of it, watching someone arrive at genuine peace with a decision made for him by his own biology rather than by his judgment, and be unable to tell the difference between the two from the inside. Eo's skin had begun the slow pale drain that meant her own threshold was approaching, not yet arrived, but close enough that her voice had lost its earlier steadiness. He's not wrong about the math, she said, and Dara heard, underneath the words, the sound of someone hoping to be told it was still all right to stop. 3 pods. 3 people, still faintly alive after 9 years alone in the dark, on the far side of a ship that was actively deciding to end. Eo's voice, when it came again over the comm, had lost the last of its earlier steadiness entirely. I want to keep arguing, she said, quiet and strained, but I can feel it arriving. I don't know how much longer I'll be useful to anyone. There was no shame in the admission, only a kind of exhausted honesty, the sound of someone watching a wave approach that she knew, with complete biological certainty, she would not be able to swim against. Get them out, Dara. Both of you. Please. It was not cowardice. Dara understood that clearly, the way she had come to understand it over 4 years of serving beside people built differently than she was. Io was not choosing to stop caring. Her body was choosing it for her, gently and with total conviction, the way a hand pulls back from a flame before the mind is finished deciding it hurts. There was no failure in that, only biology doing exactly what it had evolved to do. It simply meant that whatever happened next in this room was not going to be decided by a vote. Tovi's exhaustion had gone the palest Dara had seen it yet, and for one long moment the young Ilvan simply stood frozen at the edge of the failing section, 3 eyes fixed on the far side of the bay where the last 3 pods still blinked their slow, dying amber. I'm afraid, Tova said, very quietly, to no one and everyone. I don't know if this is the fear I've done enough already, or the fear I haven't tried hard enough yet. I can't tell them apart. I told you that's what scared me most, and here it is, and I still can't tell. Dara crossed the trembling decking toward her, unhurried, the way she moved toward most problems, and crouched down slightly so they were closer to level. Then don't decide by feeling, Dara said. Decide by what's still true. 3 people are alive over there. That doesn't stop being true just because it's inconvenient right now. Everything else is just math arguing with itself. Tovi looked at her, and something in her small frame steadied, not because the fear had gone, but because she had, quietly and for the first time, found a way to hold it without letting it choose for her. I'm coming with you, she said. I know, Dara said. I was hoping you would. They moved fast, and for the first several meters neither of them spoke, saving breath and attention both for the treacherous decking underfoot, sections of it groaning audibly now with every step, the whole compartment beginning to tilt by degrees toward whatever final collapse waited at the end of its patience. Tovi's suit lamp swept ahead of them in short, efficient arcs, no longer the nervous, cataloguing sweep of hours earlier but something closer to purposeful, a young crewmate learning, in real time, under the worst possible conditions, exactly how to be useful when it mattered most. They went together across the last stable section of decking, moving fast now, no longer with the careful economy of earlier hours but with the particular urgency of people who had decided, entirely and without further argument, what the next several minutes were going to be spent on. Behind them, over the open channel, Bren's voice cut through, sharp with an authority that had, until this exact moment, never once been ignored aboard the Long Reach. Quinn. Rel. That is a direct order to retreat. I will not lose 2 more people chasing 3 we cannot reach in time. Copy the order, Captain, Dara said, already moving. Respectfully continuing anyway. There was a long, taut silence on the channel, the sound of a captain weighing a decision that had never come up in exactly this shape before. Then Bren's voice came back, tight but resigned, the particular tone of someone who had decided that stopping them now would cost more than letting them try. Casimir, get yourself and Io to the transfer pod. I'm rerouting every scrap of remaining power reserve toward extending that structural window. It buys you minutes, Quinn, not much more. Minutes is enough, Dara said, and meant it completely. The last stretch of the bay groaned and shifted beneath them as they moved, sections of decking dropping away entirely just behind their footsteps, close enough that Tovi's breathing had gone tight and fast over the comm, but she did not stop, did not slow, matching Dara's pace with a steadiness that surprised even her. They reached the first of the 3 remaining pods with the structural warning blaring a final countdown neither of them looked at directly. Dara's hands moved fast and sure over the failing seal, the same unhurried care applied now at 3 times the speed, because speed and panic were still, even now, 2 entirely different things. "Talk to me," Tova said, working the second pod beside her, voice tight but focused. "Seal's compromised, not gone," Dara said. "Feed lines still live. We reroute here, and we've got maybe 90 seconds before the housing itself gives. And if it gives before we finish, then we finish faster," Dara said, and did not say the other thing that was also true, which was that she had already decided, somewhere in the last several minutes, that she was not leaving this room with 3 people still alive inside it and unresolved. The first pod status strip flickered, steadied, then rose from a dying amber into a slow, stable green. Tovi's followed 12 seconds later, her small hands trembling with effort and adrenaline both, but sure now, sure in a way they hadn't been at the start of the run. 1 pod left. The ship groaned again, a deep structural sound that traveled up through both their boots at once, and somewhere behind them, an entire section of the bay finally surrendered and dropped away into the dark. Dara reached the last pod with the deck already beginning to tilt beneath her, the whole compartment shifting toward whatever final collapse the reactor housing had decided was now unavoidable, and she worked the seal anyway, hands steady, because steady hands were the only tool she had left that mattered. 20 seconds. Casimir's voice reported from the transfer pod, tight with something that sounded, for the first time since Dara had known him, like genuine fear rather than calm acceptance. "Quinn, the window is closing." "Working," Dara said, and did not look up. The seal caught. The feed line held. The pod status strip climbed from its last flickering amber through to a slow, steady, certain green, and Dara felt something in her chest unclench that she had not fully realized was clenched at all. "Go," she said to Tovi, already moving herself, grabbing the young Ilvan by the arm and pulling her toward the exit as the decking behind them gave way in earnest, a rolling collapse chasing their heels down the last length of corridor toward the transfer pod, where Casimir held the hatch open with both remaining working arms and hauled them both through the instant they were close enough to reach. The hatch sealed. The pod detached. Behind them, through the small viewport, they watched the Winterbell's aft section finally, quietly, complete the collapse it had been holding off for 9 patient years, folding inward on itself in a slow silence that felt, strangely, less like tragedy and more like something long overdue finally being allowed to rest. 14 critical pods stabilized. 18 already strong. 32 survivors, total, who had spent 9 years believing, if they believed anything at all in their long sleep, that no one was coming. Nobody spoke much on the return crossing. There wasn't much that needed saying out loud. Tova sat beside Dara in the transfer pod's narrow cabin, her exoskin slowly returning to its ordinary color, and after a long while she said, quietly, "I didn't hush." "No," Dara agreed. "You didn't." "I wanted to. Somewhere in there, for just a second, I wanted the choice made for me instead of by me." "That's not the same as making it," Dara said. "Wanting an easy door and walking through it aren't the same thing. You did the harder one." Tova turned her head slightly to look at the small stitched toy still tucked in the mesh pocket of Dara's suit, the one she had rescued from the drifting dark hours earlier without quite meaning to, and something in her expression softened further. "You picked that up on the way in," she said, "before we even knew if anyone down there was still alive." "Seemed wrong to leave it tumbling," Dara said simply. "Didn't cost me anything to grab it." "It's a strange kind of person," Tova said, "who does the small kind thing on the way toward the large one, like it's obvious. Like it doesn't need deciding at all." Dara considered that, and found she didn't entirely disagree with it, though she had never thought to describe herself that way before. "Maybe it's easier that way," she said. "If you wait to be kind until the big moment asks for it, you might not remember how by the time it matters." Tovi was quiet for a while after that, watching the slow return of the relay markers on the display as the long reach carried them back across the cutoff line, back into the reach of company protocol and closed case files and all the ordinary rules that had, for 11 hours, simply not applied. "They're going to reopen the case," Tovi said eventually. "Aren't they?" "Probably," Dara said. 32 live survivors tend to complicate a closed file. "And the drone." Dara thought about the small, battered machine, still faithfully transmitting on a beacon nobody had authorized it to keep sending. 3 years past the point anyone reasonable would have called the effort finished. "The drone doesn't know it did anything remarkable," she said. "It just never had a setting that told it to stop." "Neither do you," Tova said, and it wasn't quite a question. No, Dara agreed. Neither do I. Back aboard the Long Reach, Bren logged the mission in full, coordinates, survivor count, structural failure timeline, every detail company protocol required and several it hadn't asked for. She paused for a long moment before the final field, the one marked crew commendation, optional, and after some consideration wrote a single line that would follow Dara Quinn's record for the rest of her career. Continued rescue operation past authorized cutoff, contributing directly to survival of 23 additional persons who would otherwise have been lost. No further explanation offered. None, Bren decided, was needed. She found Dara afterward in the corridor outside engineering, running a routine check on a coolant line that did not, by any reasonable measure, need checking again so soon. You disobeyed a direct order, Bren said, without heat. I did, Dara agreed. I want you to understand that I would give the same order again, under the same numbers. It was the correct call for everyone standing on that bridge at the time I gave it. I know, Dara said. It was the correct call for you. It just wasn't the only true thing in the room. Bren studied her for a long moment, forearms settling into the loose, unfolded posture that Dara had learned, over 4 years, meant the captain had already decided not to be angry and was simply working out how to say so. I have served with humans twice before you, she said finally. Both times I found it exhausting, in the way EO describes it. No off switch means no permission to stop worrying about you, either. It is a great deal of trust to place in someone who does not know their own limit. I know my limit, Dara said. I just don't get told about it in advance. I find out the same way everyone finds out anything worth knowing. By reaching it. Bren made a low sound that might, in a Bresk, have been the equivalent of a tired laugh. Get some rest, Quinn. Company will have questions in the morning, and I intend for you to be conscious enough to answer them politely. That evening, in the mess hall, EO brought Dara a cup of the ship's bad coffee substitute without being asked, and set it down across from her with the particular care of someone offering something small in place of something larger she didn't have better words for. Casimir wanted me to tell you, EO said, that he's not embarrassed about the hush. It's not something to be embarrassed about. It's just what his biology does. I never thought it was, Dara said, and meant it. I know. That's sort of the point I'm making badly. EO's skin settled into a warm, steady color that Dara had learned, over 4 years, to recognize as simple gratitude, uncomplicated by anything else. It's strange, working next to someone who doesn't have an exit built in. I used to think it made you unknowable. Now I think it just means you decide things the long way, every single time, instead of once and for good. It's more work, Dara admitted. It's also, EO said, why 32 people are going to wake up in a few days and find out someone still came. Dara drank her coffee. Outside the small viewport, the static stretched on in its patient, ordinary way, indifferent to what had or hadn't happened inside it, the way space always was and always would be, entirely unbothered by the small, stubborn shapes of people who kept choosing, again and again, without any threshold built in to stop them, to simply keep going anyway. Tova found her there a while later, sat down across the narrow table without asking, and said, in the careful, deliberate tone of someone who had been rehearsing the sentence, I want to learn how to do that. Not the fixing things part. The deciding part. The part where you don't wait for something inside you to make the call. That's not something I can teach you in an afternoon, Dara said. I know, Tova said. But you could teach me over the next several years, if the postings keep lining up that way. Dara looked at her, small and stubborn and still faintly pale from a day that had asked more of her than any training relay ever had, and found, somewhere in that look, the beginning of something she recognized from a long way back, the particular shape of a person deciding, quietly and for good, who they intended to become. Yeah, Dara said. I could do that. Weeks later, when the Winterbells reopened case finally closed for the second and truly final time, the company's revised report noted, in the dry, procedural language such reports always used, that the original closure had been an error of probability rather than fact, and that recovered survivors numbered 32, with 2 additional persons owing their continued stability directly to actions taken past the authorized search boundary. The report did not use words like brave or remarkable. It did not need to. Somewhere in its careful, bureaucratic phrasing, a small, unglamorous truth sat plainly for anyone who cared to read it closely. A case marked closed had refused to stay that way, because something aboard had simply never learned how to stop asking for help, and something answering it had never learned how to stop giving it. The beacon that had started it all had gone silent for the first time in 9 years, not because it had finally been allowed to stop, but because, at last, somebody had come.